On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we preview Kansas at Oklahoma State, Stillwater, sometimes a house of horrors for Bill Self and KU. We discuss the game and preview it on today's episode of the show.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can hear me as well Monday through Friday from 3 to 6 p.m. on Rock Chalk Sports Talk on KLWN in Lawrence. Right now, Nick Springer, shout out to him, holding down the fort there. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. We're free and available anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. Like and subscribe to the show. On today's edition of the podcast, we are discussing Kansas, Oklahoma State, previewing the game, top storylines, Oklahoma State Scouting Report, matchups of the game, and Hawks to Soar for KU. First, we're brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Kansas at Oklahoma State, Tuesday night game at 8 o'clock. Our first storyline of the game, did Kansas get their groove back beating Oklahoma, right? You lose to UCF, and certainly there were some questions from that game. You look at some of the metric sides, has Kansas a little bit lower, which was already the case coming into that game. But then Kansas goes out and dominates a good opponent in Oklahoma. Did they find their groove? Was that loss a reset that they possibly needed? Or is this just the ebbs and flows of Big 12 play, and we're going to see another setback tonight? I guess we'll find out based on the result. But this is a tough week. This is a 2-road game week for KU. You know, KU's only played 2 previous road games, and they haven't gone ultra well if you compare them to maybe where the expectation is. So they obviously won at Indiana, which I thought was a good win at the time. Indiana certainly hasn't been very good this year, and that win has gotten a little bit less impactful, I guess, as the season has gone on. Kansas was minus 6.5 on the point spread against Indiana coming into that game. They ended up winning it by 4. So they won the game maybe a little bit closer than you expect. They were also minus 7.5 against UCF, and you ended up losing that one by 5. Basically, though, that means that if you look at the 2 games, you add up the point spreads, Kansas at Indiana, Kansas at UCF, and KU's 2 road games, they've basically been expected to win by 14 points combined over the 2 games. They've lost one, they won the other close, meaning that they're 15 points below expectation of what they're supposed to do, or 7.5 points per game below expectation in their 2 road games. So if you expect them to win by 10, they're only winning by 2 or 3. If you expect them to win by 5, they're only, they're losing games on average by 2. Basically 7.5 points per game below expectation in their first 2 road games. That's a very small sample that can easily change in one game. Maybe this will be the case. But it doesn't get any easier because this 2-game road week is 2 of the most difficult places for Bill Self to play on the road so far. Since he's been the coach of Kansas. You look at Oklahoma State, I believe he is 8-8 all time at Oklahoma State in Stillwater. Is that one right at 500? They've actually won the last couple to move that number back to that range. Then you're at West Virginia this next Saturday, and total it all up between the 2, you are 13-14 is Bill Self on the road in Stillwater plus Morgantown. Now, a lot of those past West Virginia teams were with Bob Huggins, were top 25 teams, were really good opponents. That's not as much the case this year with West Virginia. A lot of the Oklahoma State teams have been really good teams. You think back to the James Anderson teams. You think back to the Marcus Smart teams, right? They've had some really good teams that have at least been NCAA tournament teams, if not, top 25 level teams. Whereas this year, again, this is, less of a quality Oklahoma State team. Then again, you just win at UCF, a team that I don't view to be an NCAA tournament team. And you lost that one, right? So you can't take really anything for granted. As far as the Oklahoma State Scouting Report here, they are just 8-8 to start the season, 0-3 in Big 12 play. I think pretty big difference, though, when you see the difference of playing at home versus playing on the road for them. They're 2 road games in Big 12 play. Lost by 17 points at Texas Tech. They lost by 24 points at Iowa State. But they lost in overtime to Baylor, who's one of the best teams in the Big 12 in their 1 Big 12 home game. So clearly played a lot better at home. That's the case for a lot of teams, especially in this conference, as difficult as the Big 12 is. It's a tough place to play, tough place for KU to play, and we'll see how that impacts it tonight. For what it's worth, though, Oklahoma State is 0-7 against KenPom top 160 teams. So it's not like they're 0-7 against top 50 teams. They're just getting beat up by a rugged schedule. Top 160, that's a pretty big range. They're 0-7. They haven't performed well against the best teams. In fact, that overtime loss to Baylor was probably their best performance against a decent to good team. As far as what they do well, solid 2-point shooting team, top 100 there. They're one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the league, at least on overall season numbers, if you include non-con play with conference play. They're a high percentage of them, over 36% from three on a very high volume. So that's always the danger, playing a team on the road. Do they get hot from three? They shoot them in high volume. Could they go 13 of 30 from three-point range? And you drop a game that you just kind of have to tip your cap. This is a really strong defensive rebounding team who's done a solid job. They're top 80 in effective field goal percentage defense, and they don't foul much either, so they're not going to give you free buckets in addition to being overall a pretty solid defense there. What they don't do well, despite some of those shooting numbers, the high volume of three on a solid percentage, this offense is ranked outside of the top 160 in KenPom, adjusted offensive efficiency, mainly because they're outside of the top 300 in the country in turnover rate. They give it up way too much. They get the ball stolen way too much. And they don't really get to the free throw line either, so that doesn't supplant what they do. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're taking a bunch of jump shots, you're shooting a bunch of threes, you're not going to get fouled as much. They don't offensive rebound well. They're actually in Big 12 only games last in the Big 12 in offensive rebounding rate, so they're not getting a bunch of extra possessions. And beyond that, it hasn't helped that I mentioned they've shot well overall in the season, over 36%, but in their 3 Big 12 games, they're at 29% from three. Now that can be a little bit, I don't know, dangerous or a good thing coming into this game, because maybe them shooting 29% from three in their first 3 Big 12 games, maybe it's indicative that what they did in the non-con where they were shooting really well from three, maybe that's not who they are, and they just played a bunch of easier opponents and got more easy looks, and now they're playing better opponents. They're not as good of a 3-point shooting team. That's the positive way to look at it, at least what you hope tonight for KU. The negative way to look at it is that they are a good 3-point shooting team over the course of the season, and they've had just a down last 3 game shooting, and they are ripe for a turnaround at some point in these next couple games that they could at any moment go off from three. You just hope you're not part of the ticking time bomb there. They also don't really force turnovers. They don't get blocks or steals, so they don't create a lot of chaos plays. Very different from last year when they had Musa Cisse before he transferred away this past offseason. For what it's worth, they do play a bit of a slower tempo. It's not like Park the Break Virginia slow, but it's definitely on the slower end of things, about below average there. As far as the personnel, their point guard, Javon Small, I would argue he's their best player, 14.8 points per game, 5.1 rebounds, 4.3 assists. He's shooting over 40% from 3-point range on good volume, over 80% on free throws, good shooter, and he's somebody who can get his own bucket. The shooting guard is a familiar face, Bryce Thompson. Now, he'll play the 2, he'll play the 3, and Thompson is averaging 12.6 points per game, 42% shooting, also 37% from 3, also solid volume. He's been really solid this year. He was solid last year. I do think it's interesting, though, that, Bryce Thompson, it feels like he's never taken that next step up. When you're talking about a McDonald's All-American 5-star, even if it doesn't hit right away, we've seen enough players, maybe struggle in year 1 or year 2. I think back to just a couple KU guys, like Wayne Selden, his freshman, sophomore year, wasn't super efficient, didn't have great years. Then he broke out as a junior and had a really good year. Quentin Grimes wasn't great as a freshman at Kansas, inconsistent. He was a little bit better in year 2 at Houston. And then by year 3 at Houston, he's turns himself into an NBA draft pick, right? That hasn't happened with Bryce Thompson, even through the early season struggles. He's been a really solid player over the last 2 or 3 years. So he's been a good player, a positive overall player. But you felt like for years, okay, he keeps coming back to school. Eventually, he's going to take that jump and be this just, really, really good player, all conference level player. That hasn't totally happened. But still, he's a good enough shooter, and he has played really well against Kansas in the past. Last year, he had 40 points combined in the 2 games. The one in Allen Fieldhouse, I think he had 23 when Oklahoma State almost beat Kansas. He certainly becomes somebody interesting to watch. Quinn Williams also gets a chunk of minutes at the 3. He'll play the 4 a little bit as a 6'5", 220 wing when they want to play small ball. Good glue guy, 7 points, 6 rebounds, 2.5 assists per game, almost a steal and a half, solid efficiency on lower volume. Eric Daly is their starting 4. He's just a freshman, and he's a really good young player, one to watch for the future. 6'8", 230 pounds. Really talented youngster. He's getting almost 10 points, 6 rebounds, over 2 assists per game. He has struggled from 3 in terms of the percentage. He's in the 20s, but he's not shy from taking them. So, very confident player from the outside. He'll score all over, skilled player, and he's actually the team leader in Evan Miyakawa's defensive BPR for the team's best kind of defender out there. Really good young freshman for them. Brandon Garrison is the main 5. He's 6'11", 245. He's a freshman as well. They'll also use 6'10", 250-pound senior Mike Marsh. maybe a few minutes here or there when they want to play really small with Daly at the 5. But for the most part, it's Garrison and Marsh. Garrison is a solid rebounder and shot blocker, and collectively the two average about 12 points, 10 rebounds, 2.5 assists, over 2 blocks, 57% from the floor. They're not going to be overly involved in the post or getting up a ton of shots here and there, or scoring, you wouldn't think, like 20 points unless some breakdowns by the KU defense. But overall, solid enough players that don't super jump out. You also see guards John Michael Wright, Jarius Hicklin, Jamarion Kelly off the bench. All of those players can come off and hit a 3 or 2 in a specific game and are dangerous shooting the basketball for you. Let's get to our matchups of the game between Kansas and Oklahoma State. Then our Hawks, the Soar, players we think could stand out for the Hawks on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. First, we're brought to you by Jase Medical. I know we come to sports to escape some of the crazy realities of life, but can we just talk for a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. You can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if you have a significant other or a child or somebody gets sick while supply chain issues keep them from life-saving medication that they need. Thankfully, we'll be okay because of Jase Medical. The Jase case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, among others. This stuff could happen to any of us. Visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It'll be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jasemedical.com and use offer code Locked On to get $20 off your order. Matchups of the game for Kansas and Oklahoma State. And thank you to every dayers out there tuning into everything. You can check out our episode talking about Lance Leipold staying at Kansas, some of the latest offseason news. KU got a new commit from Iowa State. So find all that anywhere you get your podcasts or on our YouTube page. Number one matchup here is the turnover battle. I mean, this is super obvious after KU's last game. We saw the difference of KU having big turnover games in the first 2 games. You almost lose to TCU, and you do lose to UCF. So then you have 2 turnovers, a new program record, a new school record for KU, and you win by double digits against a good Oklahoma team in a game that you didn't shoot well and that you didn't have one of your best defensive games of the year. So the turnover battle always going to be important for this KU team. Now, you're not going to expect 2 turnovers. The KU best, that was the best ever. But can you keep it in single digits game to game? Can you keep it around 10 or 11 on the higher nights, 12 on the higher nights? And the good news is that Oklahoma State is in the first percentile, meaning they're at the lowest mark of the country in points off turnovers per game over their last 5 games. So they're not getting turnovers and runouts that are leading to baskets. They are in the 99th percentile for worst here lately, if you flip that the other way, right? First percentile in being good at it, 99th percentile in being bad at it. So when KU has been turnover prone, some of that has been the other team getting steals, but a lot of it has been their own doing. The good news is Oklahoma State's not one of those teams that's going to force them into as much and force them into them. The bad news, though, is because of that, because a lot of it has just been KU making, maybe dumb plays or wrong decisions or whatever it is, playing on the road, maybe even Oklahoma State not being a great turnover defense doesn't preclude it from still happening. But how about on the other end too, forcing them? Over the last 5 games, Oklahoma State is in the 99th percentile for highest turnover rate on offense, meaning they're one of the biggest turnover teams in the country over the last 5 games. Kansas should be able to not just avoid turnovers in this game, and that'll be a key to them winning on the road, but they should be able to force a lot of them. And so if you're doing both of those and winning the possession game, KU should be able to win this one going away. But if Kansas does have too many of those unforced turnovers and they don't force as many as maybe you should on paper, and Oklahoma State starts hitting some threes from the outside like they get rolling, that's how Oklahoma State pulls the upset. Number 2, speaking of which, Kansas defending the 3-point arc. Oklahoma State, over their last 5 games, is taking just 28.8 2-point shots per game. Out of comparison, to show you, because KU, we know they funnel the ball inside. Kansas is shooting 42 shots or 2-point shots per game over their last 5 games. So KU's taken almost 14 more shots per game, 13 more shots per game from 2-point range over the last 5 games. Meanwhile, on the season, while Oklahoma State's averaging 28.8 2-point shots per game over the last 5, on the season, Oklahoma State averages 25.6 3-point attempts per game. So they are basically taking almost as many threes as they are taking 2. It's super high volume, and they've shot them at a strong rate up until Big 12 play. And they do it taking threes everywhere, too. It's not just one area where you can be like, well, just limit the corner threes, or just limit the above the break threes, or limit the threes at the top of the arc. They take them everywhere. They're over the 80th percentile in above the break threes, and they're over the 80th percentile in corner threes per game. And they're shooting both at a high percentage, 36.8% on above the break threes, 35.3% on corner threes. You can't just take away one area. They do it all over. You have to be able to defend the arc. Some of the three-point defense is just hoping the opponent isn't on that night. Some of it is hoping that, they're not just going to hit contested shots. Typically, though, over the long haul, contested shots miss more than non-contested shots from three, right? So have a good game defending the three-point arc. And, don't lose anybody. Don't give them wide open threes. Number 3 is paint offense versus Oklahoma State's interior defense. KU's bread and butter on offense, and you should be having a huge edge in this one. So I think that kind of makes this one a little bit more prominent for KU to try to take advantage of what you view as a strength. They average 38.8 points in the paint per game. Oklahoma State averages just 30.3 points in the paint per game. That's a big difference. That's the difference between being in the 95th percentile versus being in the 39th percentile in the country. I know 8.5 points, it doesn't sound like that big of a difference. It really is when you look at things over the course of college basketball. But in games where Oklahoma State holds opponents to 50% or worse from 2-point range, Oklahoma State is 7-4. That's a fine record, but it pales in comparison when opponents shoot above 50% from 2 against them. Oklahoma State is just 1-4. KU has all the makings of being a team that should shoot above 50% from 2 against them. But what's interesting here is the Cowboys have done a solid job preventing teams from getting a ton of looks at the rim specifically, which is where KU loves to get their shots. Oklahoma State's in the 84th percentile, according to CBB Analytics, in field goal attempt percentage at the rim. They have given up a ton of shots in the paint that aren't at the rim. So basically you have at the rim, which is kind of where that restricted area is. The rest of the paint shots forward toward the free throw line, that is considered in the paint, but not at the rim. They're in the 98th percentile, highest in the country, one of the highest in the country in terms of the most shots allowed in those situations in the paint. Problem for KU is they've struggled in such shots. Despite shooting 62% at the rim, Kansas is at just 31% in those paint shots. So how does this matchup go? Does Oklahoma State limit KU's at the rim shots and make them take more of the at the paint shots where they've struggled? Does Kansas get more open looks in at the paint shots? And we see KJ Adams or somebody have a big game with the push shots and everything that they do? Or does Oklahoma State's lack of at the rim shots that they've allowed so far this year, does that advantage that they normally have game in, game out go away in a game like this because they haven't seen a team like Kansas? Or, even when you look at some of their Big 12 games, like Baylor's not really feeding the post as much. Like what they do with their centers, they're more so, rim running or rolling to the rim. And maybe they haven't played a team like Kansas who can just kind of post them up inside, which it is an Oklahoma State team that is a little bit smaller compared to some of the other teams, specifically when they do play small ball. Our player matchup here is Kevin McCullar versus Bryce Thompson. Bryce Thompson, obviously the former Kansas commit, 20 points per game in the 2 games against Kansas last year. He's been a solid player. He's gotten hot from Kansas or against Kansas from the outside and really been able to score it. He plays some 2, he plays some 3. I'll be interested to see how KU matches it up. We know they switch, and so there will be all sorts of different matchups. But I think for the most part, you might see this matchup, Kevin McCullar on Bryce Thompson. And that would make it even more of an interesting, matchup there. And Kevin obviously has been so imperative for KU on the offensive end. In addition to that, Bryce has been, I would say, above average so far defensively this year if you look at some of the metric numbers in terms of what he's doing. So that should be a really fun matchup with 2 good players and 2 former transfers, one from Kansas, one from another Big 12 school. Let's get on to our Hawks to Soar KU players we think can stand out in this one on Locked On Jayhawks. We're brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, and there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. Find bets in the new Explore tab. Make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays and more, such as you can bet on futures. Right now, you can get KU to win the national title at 25-1 because of that UCF loss. Metrics don't love them as much. A lot further than they were earlier in the season when they were 10-1, 12-1. So now would be the time to get in on them if you believe that can happen. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Hawks to Soar. KU players I think can stand out in this one for the Jayhawks. I picked Dwan Harris last game, and I'm going to pick him again. Now, Javon Small is a really good offensive player. It's going to be imperative for Dwan Harris to play good defense in this game. On the flip side, though, Small has not been a great defender, according to Evan Miyakawa's DBPM. And it makes sense when you're having to shoulder as much of a load he does offensively. He's a transfer from East Carolina, too. Like, I don't know that he's ever been known as being a great defender. So Dwan should be able to get to certain spots he wants to. And on top of that, Oklahoma State does not force a ton of turnovers, so that should be helpful for him, the guy who mainly handles the ball. But Oklahoma State's also pretty loose with the basketball as well. That should mean Dwan should be able to get 2 or 3 steals in a game like this. He had 3 last game. Let's see it happen again. Outside of that, I think just in general, like pick and pop opportunities for Hunter Dickinson, short rolls for KJ Adams are going to be there. We mentioned that Oklahoma State doesn't give up a ton of shots at the rim. When they are playing smaller or because they play smaller, it might be a lot of doubles on Hunter Dickinson when you get it to him in the post. So maybe that means you can find KJ Adams, who maybe they'll double off his guy in the free throw line area and he can hit a jump shot. Maybe that even means a double comes and it's a big night for Johnny Furphy hitting corner threes or Kevin McCullar hitting corner threes. So those corner threes I think will be imperative, but also I think there will be a bit of an opening for KU if they want it on some of those pick and pop shots in the mid-range and in that area. KJ Adams in the short roll around the free throw line where Oklahoma State does give up a lot of shots this season. I think KJ struggled a bit with that shot last game, but we've seen him hit it a lot over the course of this season. In fact, he's been one of KU's better shooters in kind of that in the paint, but not at the rim area on the season. So maybe a big game for him in addition to Hunter Dickinson and Dwan Harris. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the action. See you next time with a KU Oklahoma State recap on LOJ.